Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today it's with great pleasure that I'm hosting, for the second time, a fellow Italian, Dr. Maria Chiara Rioli. Maria, first of all, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Roberto. Thank you for this invitation.
Maria is currently a fellow at the Maria Curie Global in Ca' Foscari and also in Venice, and Fordham in New York. Maria, before getting this position, she was the project manager of the ERC-funded project Open Jerusalem. We talked about the Open Jerusalem in a number of episodes, particularly with former director Vincent Lemire. So you can find a lot of details about the Open Jerusalem in that particular episode. And she's also currently the coordinator of the Scientific Advisory Board of Ithaca, which is another Horizon 2020 European funded project. And we certainly talk about it, which is about refugees and sort of the collections of the material and the history behind the refugees. More importantly, in the context of Jerusalem Unplugged, Maria is the author of a very important book, one of the best that I read during the pandemic, published in 2020 by Brill, A Liminal Church, Refugees, Conversions in the Latin Diocese of Jerusalem, 1946 to 1956. And we will obviously talk about the book and how the book came about, given the variety of interests and the professional trajectories that Maria covered in her life. But first of all, Maria, what is your Jerusalem? In other words, what is your connection with the city?
So thank you for these questions and thank you for your invitation. I'm so delighted to talk with you, Roberto, today. My Jerusalem. The first time that I visited Jerusalem was in 2009. Jerusalem was a place, a city where I lived. Jerusalem became a subject of study, and it became also much more than that. We can say that it's an ordinary, extraordinary city also for my personal life.
As we start a conversation about the city, I just want to first talk about one of the topics that is really connected to your professional life, and I suspect also to your personal life. And it's the question of refugees. In the book, you obviously talk about the refugees in Palestine, 1948, but also in different projects. Ithaca, that you are currently sort of coordinating, but also in your previous works. If anyone wants to look at the CV, it's quite impressive. I can certainly see that you have been drawn to the question of refugees. And I was wondering if you can tell us something about your connection with refugees and how you came about to work on refugees.
Yeah, sure. So when I moved to Jerusalem, actually, I didn't move to Jerusalem. My first stay in Israel and Palestine was in Bet Zahur, so in the Palestinian territories. At that time, I was a freelance journalist, and I had just started my PhD, which was at the time actually quite diverse. It was about the apartheid regime in South Africa and the role of the Roman Catholic Church in the segregationism. So I arrived in Palestine with an Italian program of civil service for conscientious objectors. And I used to volunteer with the Alternative Information Center, which at the time was a joint Palestinian-Israeli non-governmental organization. Historically, the AIC, the Alternative Information Center, is one of the very first joint Palestinian-Israeli association movements, grassroots movements, well known for its political advocacy and grassroots activism. Established in the early 1980s, now it's the Alternative Information Palestine. And for me, it was completely new experience, knowing, meeting Israeli activists from Matzpen or Palestinian activists from the West Bank and Gaza. So that was the context where also I discovered the refugee issues. So actually I wasn't so much informed on Palestinian refugee and Palestinian refugee history itself. And living in Bet Sahura and visiting and working with refugees in Bethlehem, yeah, that was the very first experience of knowledge and life with Palestinian refugees. That's where also my book started in some way, its journey, its way.
But yet you are not making the jump from your work on South Africa into Jerusalem. So I was just wondering, how did you transition and when that happened, and what motivated you to somehow abandon your first ideas and then start working on Jerusalem?
Yeah, sure. So the daily reality of what I lived in Bet Sahura and in the area, I was in charge of the settler violence report for the AIC. Actually, all these experiences impressed me profoundly. And I felt that the only way to try to give further complexity was history. So that's why before leaving for Palestine and Israel, also I knew that just some weeks before, some heads of the Palestinian churches published the Cairo's Palestine document, which is an important publication denouncing Israeli occupation and also Christian Zionism. I mean, it's one of the most important declarations by Christian leaders, and it was issued in Bethlehem, December 2009. And I arrived to Bethlehem. I translated the document in Italian. It was published in Italian in many different languages. You can find it online. And so finding the link, because the first Cairo's document was released in South Africa against apartheid, and there was historically a strong link between anti-apartheid leaders and Palestinian church leaders. This was actually, for me, the link and the way to cross the boundary and to move also to the study of the Roman Catholic Church in Palestine, Israel, and actually also in Jordan, because as we will see, the borders of the Roman Catholic Diocese are larger actually, rather than being limited only to one region.
Before moving and talking about the Catholic Church in Palestine, and particularly in Jerusalem, which obviously is the main bulk and is going to be the main bulk of our conversation, but I want to bring you back to also your previous work as a project manager of the, as mentioned earlier, the ERC-funded Open Jerusalem project. Now, the Open Jerusalem, as we talked about with Saint Lemire, is this project that brought together scholars from different parts of the world with the idea to map the archives about Jerusalem, in Jerusalem, and around the world, obviously dealing with the city itself. It was a fascinating project, which also showed the fact that Jerusalem is not just a global city because of a different composition of its inhabitants, but it's global because essentially it's a city that extended its influence and reach obviously beyond the borders of the city itself and across a large number of countries. And I was wondering if you can tell us about a little bit more about the archives about Jerusalem, and what did you find interesting about digging into these archives? What is that you learned that you didn't know about the city of Jerusalem?
Yes, so you were talking about Open Jerusalem. Open Jerusalem is part of a wider, actually, archival renewal. We can use this term also in Jerusalem and about Jerusalem. Open Jerusalem worked from 2014, but it still continues, and we will release in the coming weeks new archival catalogs, especially related to the the Jordanian period. So from 1948 to 1967, the minutes of the municipal council. So just to give you the sense that the work is still ongoing and it's continuing. The issue of archives and the possibility to access new archives and unpublished sources links Open Jerusalem with other Palestinian, Israeli, international experiences and enterprise. What actually we can find in Jerusalem archives, first of all, it's the possibility to connect the city. So to really to go beyond the vision of sectarian approaches to one community divided from the others. And what you experience is the multilingualism and the variety of actors that you can encounter through archival investigation. So generally people, in some way also scholars, approach archives as inert places of storage. Jerusalem, on the contrary, reveals all the richness of archives, where you can really meet in some way ordinary people, not ordinary people, and new ways and new possibilities of the history of the city that you didn't imagine before, actually. So in the case of Jerusalem, this is pretty important, because if we think about Jerusalem nowadays, we don't have this image of variety or interconnection or mixity. On the contrary, history and archives revealed that this is not a peaceful or calm history or a soft history, not at all. It's conflictual. So archives are full of conflicts. For me, it was moving, and I mean, moving in as an historian, it was really impressive when I found in the Italian archives, in the foreign office of the Italian archives, a document that I found in Italian, and there was also the translation in Amharic in the Orthodox Ethiopian community archives in Jerusalem. So this kind of interaction among sources is what is a sign also of the interaction of the daily life in a city. So this is one of the most intriguing aspects of our work, actually.
I remember when I was talking with Vincent about the question of the archives, one of the issues was about the politicization of the material that you can find in archives. And, you know, one of the biggest issues that we saw in recent times in Jerusalem is the question of ownership of buildings, and how, as you mentioned, just people, ordinary people can actually get access to that historical material and then eventually use it to make or support their claims. So I guess I was wondering if there's any danger and, you know, when you deal with this such kind of material, and how you as an historian using that material that you can find, connecting the various dots of a complex and multi-layered city as Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's extremely problematic, and documents are in some cases very sensitive. We know that in Jerusalem, claiming rights, access, ownership can be justified through archives. So, and completely opposing claims. So being aware that archives themselves act as knowledge producers and not only as source containers, so that archives were produced by institutions, individuals that add their own agenda, is one of the main aspects of awareness that the historian has to always experiment and practice. And archives, of course, encounters silences, expectations, dilemmas. So ethically, it's extremely sensitive, and it's sensitive if we talk about 1948, 1967, and also other period of Israeli-Palestinian history, and more generally contemporary history. So the exercise of a rigorous methodology, the use and the awareness of the consequences of while dealing with documents, and also the reasons behind the willing by institutions to make the archives available is another aspect for historians to be aware, actually. We know, for example, all the problems behind the digitization made by the Israeli State Archives. So also digital history in this sense is problematic. That's why, coming back to Open Jerusalem project, we decided not to focus primarily on digitization rather than on cataloging, because this way was another way to give historians, but also people simply interested in the history of the city, the keys to access, but not to substitute their work, actually. Not to give simply the digitized document that in some way erases the history of the document and also depoliticize the work of the historian. So re-giving keys to entrance to archives is another way to make people more aware of the political uses and abuses of history.
This makes me think about also the very title of the project, Open, in a sense that when you look around the world, history as a discipline is on the downfall. You know, many universities are merging history programs with other disciplines, and in some European countries, they even removed history from some final exams, particularly at the high school level. But when you look at Jerusalem, history is paramount. People have memory, buildings have memory. History defines the city itself. And in a sense also defines the relationship between the various communities within the city. And so I was wondering, you know, this process of opening, is there a silver lining at the end? Do you think that opening may be helpful somehow, or this is just a sort of an academic exercise? And, you know, without being this one negative, obviously, but I was just wondering if there's a final goal for the Open Jerusalem project and what this would be.
Yeah, opening, of course, is a word that can be interpreted in many different ways. You were talking about the conception also of history and the worldwide audience. We can see what you were saying, but at the same time, looking at the public interest about history, we see the opposite, actually. So there is a general need of history by non-expert audience. That's why channels on historical topics are largely developing all around the world. Academic, non-academic, actually, blogging on historical topics also are developing. There is, in the Israeli-Palestinian case, you see all the interest behind genealogy, which is, of course, also driven by political or biographical needs and claims, but it's also, it witnessed this sense of the role of history in the global and in the current scenario for different societies. So in this sense, opening a response to a question by a non-informed audience, and this recalls the importance for the historian to teach and to give access also to non-informed public the tools and the methodologies of the historical work and the use of sources and records. And at the same time, opening, it's something more nuanced. It's a way to say that the time for oblivion has passed. Also in the Israeli-Palestinian history, this can be in some way true, and that the time of history has come. And this is important if we talk, for example, about 1948 and 1967, or the first or the second Intifada. The time for oblivion has passed, so the time for history has to come.
Archives are fascinating places, connected with mystery and stories. They do preserve the history of people, and as such, they they're very rich. I remember when I first visited the Vatican Archives, and it was very much a period of a famous movie with Tom Hanks, the Da Vinci Code. And so I remember going around and saying, hey, I actually have been to the Vatican Archives. They don't really look like, those that are portrayed in the movie, but it's still very fascinating. I was wondering which actually have been the two most surprising or fascinating archives that you visited, one in Jerusalem and one outside Jerusalem.
Yes, so in Jerusalem, maybe, for me, the most revealing archive is what we can say it's not an archive. So it recalls the liquid definition of archives that in some ways we were retracing during our conversation, Roberto. So archives in the city are everywhere. You can find archives in institutions, so where you expect to have archives, although maybe institutions in some cases repeat that they don't have archives, which is a classic answers that historians receive. But you also see, you find archives on roofs, on the basements of buildings, so in really unexpected places. For me, in August 2014, I was in Jerusalem. I was doing research for my PhD, and I was living on the roof of the Franciscan hostel. You have a breathtaking view on the old city, sorry. You're in the St. Saviour compound. On the roof, there is a room. There were books stored, just thrown away, actually. And I received the answer very prior that these books were to be destroyed. And with my husband, we started to look at these documents. And actually not me, but he found an album of visiting cards from the late Ottoman period, so late 19th century until early 20th century, more than 1,500 visiting cards from all the inhabitants and tourists and people composing the variety of Jerusalem. And these documents actually, for me, were revealing of the richness of the archives, but also the interconnection, because were printed by the Franciscan Printing Press, so by a Franciscan institution, so a Christian one, but you could find the flyers of the Ramadan prayers, documents in Hebrew, documents in Armenian, so all the different languages of the city, invitation for marriages, but also for Bar Mitzvah, so all these different aspects of life. There were the cards of the members of the municipal council, but there were also cards of midwives and dragomans and middlemen. And so women, men, young people, pilgrims, all the voices that these documents echoed, and also the reception among scholars, so the exchange that I had with scholars after this, let's say, discovery were to me very inspiring. And I wasn't aware of the richness of this document, and this is another point for me. Historians really need to collaborate with other historians, but also to people with other expertise, because it was through another view of my husband in this case, but also to reflect in other eyes the richness of the document, that you feel the importance of what you're reading in a much more complex way. And abroad, outside Jerusalem, yeah, you were mentioning the Vatican Archives. Of course, visiting for the first time the Vatican Archives, you get the sense that you were explaining, so this sense of mystery, intrigue, but and in my case, this was in some way also true, because I was when the Pius XII Archives opened, and maybe we can talk later about that. But on the contrary, the documents on the Pontifical Mission for Palestine. So we come back to the Palestinian refugees. The documents of the Palestinian Mission for Palestine devoted to the assistance of Palestinian refugees since 1949, gathered at the archives of the Congregation for the Oriental Churches in Rome. Yes, these archives, the letters from refugees, requests, claims, petitions, and their interconnection between these documents and other documents that they found in New York or in London or in Paris or in Bethlehem. Yeah, this circulation of documents is something for also for the awareness of the life entering in documents, how life matters, how history matters.
You made me think about, business cards are, generally speaking, considered some sort of rubbish. And I can see why the Franciscans were kind of like throwing them away after such a long time. But on the other hand, they actually give us a sense of, real life, as you were just saying, like, who are these people, the names, the addresses, where they live, the businesses were conducted, and also a sense of the relationship between these people and the connections that were taking place. So again, sometimes there is a fine line between what someone may consider like garbage and, an historian we may consider actually a very important document, because it tells us about not just a story, but, a larger history. And again, talking about the importance of archives, I was just thinking about a book, before we're going to talk about your book, that was recently published by Eliezer Tauber about what he calls the myth of the Yassin. And the book is called The Massacre That Never Was. And again, and you can see how, the selective use of archival material certainly, creates a lot of problems. And while these books may be for scholars, the reality is that, particularly in the Palestinian-Israeli context and in the context of Jerusalem, they do have an impact on the larger life, because they become political and they, support or do not support, claims of one group or the other. So again, the relevance of talking about archives, it's not just an academic, sort of a idea or an academic privilege, but actually archives do matter in daily life of people. And this brings me to your book, which was published in 2020. And as I said earlier, and I don't have any problem repeating that, one of the best books I read during the pandemic, when I had a little bit more time to sit down and read books. And the book is A Liminal Church. A Liminal Church refers to the Latin Church, or the Catholic Church. And so I was wondering if you can, first of all, give us a sense of the Catholic community in Jerusalem and in Palestine at large, and what is the Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem, which many may have heard of, and those who visit Jerusalem may even see, even though it's in a little bit, it's in a corner, and so not necessarily tourists go by the church itself, but it's certainly a very important institution in the city.
Yes, sure. So the Roman Catholic Church has different forms of presence in the city and also in Palestine, Israel, historically. The Latin Patriarchate, it's, let's say that it's the Diocese of Jerusalem, and that's why I chose also this specific word for the title. It's the Patriarchal Diocese. It means that it's a territory administered by a bishop. In this case, the bishop is the patriarch because of the particular importance of Palestine. The other most relevant institution of Roman Catholic Church in the city, it's the Franciscan Custody of the Holy Land. Physically, for people visiting Jerusalem, you can find the seats of both these institutions in the so-called Christian neighborhood, close to the Jaffa Gate. And the Latin Patriarchate, after all the history during Crusades and medieval time, it was re-established in 1847 during the renewal of interest to Jerusalem and Palestine let's call it the Christian East, by Christian churches, but also we know by European powers and the establishment of the consulates and the re-emergence of Jerusalem in the international scenario. Nowadays, the Latin Patriarchate is known for its schools, hospitals, and different kind of welfare association and realities. And it's also linked to the Christian and Catholic congregations living in the region that are themselves working in welfare association or assistance associations and the realities. Historically, the patriarchs are usually Italian, but there were also Arab patriarchs, Palestinian and Jordanian. It's complex history because it's not only composed by Arab faithful, but also for European or Western clergy, and also the a small community that is nowadays the Hebrew-speaking vicariates within the Latin Patriarchate. A small community it's not so correct, but maybe we can talk a bit more about that later by explaining also the history during after 1948 of this community.
We will certainly engage with the question of a St. James Vicariate, this very interesting group that emerged in the past few decades. But I want to go back to the Latin Patriarchate. So obviously, when we think about the Catholic Church, people tend to think about this worldwide institution, which is often considered very powerful, and if not powerful, certainly very influential. The reality in Palestine is that obviously the numbers are very small, but yet, the Latin Patriarchate is very prominent, and the patriarchs throughout its reestablishment in 1847 always had some sort of a visible presence in Jerusalem. Now, your book focuses for the most part in the period between 1946 and 1956. So I really must ask here, what was the role of the Catholic Church during the War of 1948, which ended with the declaration of a State of Israel and also with the Palestinian Nakba? And how did the Church navigate this very complex period of time?
Yes, so in my book, I try to follow actually the traces of different communities within the Roman Catholic Church, actually trying to go beyond the sectarian approach that I mentioned before, talking with you, Roberto, because it's evident that every community is made by people, so people interact among each other, and historically, especially in the late Ottoman period, if we see, for example, the documents related to Christian congregations, the list of pupils attending Christian schools, we discovered that there were Muslims, Jewish students, and so all the interaction, and non-Catholic students, so from other Christian denominations. So what was normal was that Christian institutions were not linked only to people self-declaring Christians or baptized. And this is another element of interest to focus on the specific archives, because they, rather than being confessionalized, you discover all the richness of relations among communities, institutions, and people, and families, and cities, villages. So during 1948, in my book, the point of view of these communities through convents, schools, or small communities, or other forms of points of observation were to analyze how the events were lived, so also lived, perceived, analyzed, re-narrated into other people later during the same times through the correspondence, for example, with the other religious community in Europe. So this is another way to reconstruct the social history of 1948 that still is a problem, not only an historical problem, as you were mentioning before, also a political problem, because this lack of social history opens the path also to abuses of interpretation or misinterpretations or ideological interpretations that are not historically grounded and based on source evidences. So during this period, the church lives all the changes and the battles and the transformations coming from the war for Palestine. We know that the war for Palestine is not only a military experience, it's also a humanitarian changes, a political, social, actually, huge transformation for different societies. And in this sense, looking through the Roman Catholic archives, but to all the interconnection of these documents, we see this transformation. You were quoting the Yasin, for example, in the documents, in the chronicles, the convents, you see the reference of refugees coming from the Yasin in the very days of the events coming. So you find names of people moving from one convent to another, moving from different parts of the old city of Jerusalem. You see the efforts of the Christian institutions to claim for the truce in 1948. You can find all the events on a daily basis, and that's what I try to do really in a part of the book. It's almost a daily narrative of the 1948, actually 1947, 1949 events through these unexplored sources. But it's you find other chronicles from Acre, from Akko, and also the Jordanian side, how, for example, the communities in Jordan were reshaped by the arrival of the refugees, and the humanitarian effort also there, as well as the interconnection between at its foundation between humanitarian agencies driven by the Catholic Church and UNRWA, for example. So you really see the changes on the ground through this kind of archives. Rather than being sectarian, they are actually powerful tool to retrace many different sectors of the societies involved in the conflict.
I was wondering, let's say more specifically about the church, particularly in Jerusalem, how they dealt with the influx of refugees, and also how they negotiated with the creation of a state of Israel and on the Palestinian refugee problem later. And again, you have a church here that found itself in the middle, where most of the followers of the Catholic and Latin church in Palestine, Jerusalem, are obviously Palestinian descent, but also the leadership is mostly European, and so they also had sort of the heritage of what just happened a few years earlier during World War II, and that including also the Holocaust. So I was just wondering, how did the local church in Jerusalem, and not necessarily the Latin Patriarchate, but also the parishes of the Patriarchate, kind of dealt with all of these rapid and dramatic changes?
Yes, so there were parishes forced to close. There were buildings that previously had hosted pilgrims, for example, the Casanove, which are traditionally the buildings from the Franciscan custody, were aimed at hosting pilgrims nowadays, were transformed into foyer, into buildings for hosting refugees. And it's interesting also in this sense to really go to, for example, the list of the names of the refugees hosted in this kind of buildings, because you find the names of the families, you find the neighborhoods of provenance from the different neighborhoods of Jerusalem. You also find the rooms actually where they moved from one room to another, for example, because some members of the family arrived later. And the reaction, and after 1948 also the conflict between refugees and the friars, because at some point the friars wanted to reopen the Casanove as hosting to host pilgrims, but refugees were still there. So there were efforts of avoid a conflictual end, but still conflicts are part of also humanitarian efforts. So this is evident in every kind of humanitarian initiative, and you find it also in this kind of historical experience. So there were canteens open to give the bread, for example, and this is true in Jerusalem, but for example, it's true also in Nazareth. You have powerful photographs of people asking for bread in Nazareth. This kind of, view on the city changes also the narrative, the general narrative, because it gives much more specific, but at the same time, the possibility to link this kind of humanitarian emergency to other cases. Because what's interesting also, it's not unique, of course. So it can be compared to the other experience of, for example, of hosting refugees in the city, Armenian refugees coming after the genocide, and also after 1948, 1967, or other moments of Jerusalem history. So it's important to the observation, the uniqueness of 1948, and at the same time the historical trends and recurrences related to refugee history in the city and beyond.
One of the most intriguing, but I think one of the sort of the best part of this work, and this, some sort of a message to the listeners, check out this book, because often the question of the Palestinian refugees is seen through a certain set of sources that we all know and are aware of. What Maria Chiara did was to look into a new set of sources, Catholic material coming from churches, and give us a sense of, the events, how they were unfolding, but more importantly, providing us with even more and better information, particularly about the refugees themselves as individuals, something that, churches do often, as part of a job, is really to record, not just deaths, birth certificates, but in fact, many churches do have books where they chronicle events. Sometimes this is like, can go from a very boring day where nothing really happened, but also it can include very important details. And I think this is one of the sort of the most important contribution of Maria Chiara's work in relation to the literally emerging Palestinian refugee question when looking at 1948 through the small but very relevant Catholic lenses. I want to ask you something about the church in Jerusalem during the Jordanian period, because this is a fascinating era when the city was divided between 1948 and 1967, and very little has been written. Kimberly Katz, among one of them, but not many others, have engaged with the Jordanian side of the city, and particularly and so I was wondering what happened to the Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem during this period of time, and how was the life also for Catholics and Latins in the city in this period?
Yes, so the Patriarchate was divided, obviously, and it's interesting to see, for example, the Patriarch moving from both sides of the city and of its diocese, and the differences between this side, let's say, and also the new interaction with the new actors emerging from 1948. For example, there are documents related to relations between the Latin Patriarchate and the Jordanian period Jerusalem municipality, which is something almost unknown. It's linked to, again, to the refugees, because there were requests from the municipality to the Latin Patriarchate to provide assistance aid funds to some actions pursued by the Jerusalem municipality. So these kind of interactions are still quite unexplored, and it's important to give light to that, to know more about this period, because we could say that this is a period interpreted under the light of 1967 in some ways. Still, it's approached in some way in this way, but this is not the case, because you find in this period also many initiatives from the ground actually emerging, of movements, associations. You have the petitions from refugees, the emergence of the awareness of the condition on the subject of the refugees themselves, but also of other institutions. You have all you have the emergence of a new, also in some way, political liturgy after the establishment of the State of Israel. And you have the relation, of course, between the new state and the Latin Patriarchate, which are related also to the re-establishment of parishes, to compensation and reparations, to all some of the most sensitive topics still, I mean, nowadays. You can find the depopulated villages claiming to coming back and asking for the help of the Patriarchate, and all the diplomatic actions develop in this sense. The interactions between the Latin Patriarchate in Jerusalem, the Vatican in Rome, and the Israeli government, or the issue of the sense of belonging or not belonging, especially not belonging by Palestinians to Jordan, and all the conflict between Palestinian faithful and Jordanian faithful. So it's a very dynamic period that cannot be interpreted only considering what happened after, and not only under the light of the shadow years, and I quote in this sense the Shadow Dumani words. So of course 1948 and 1967 are shadow years, and they reflect these shadows also to the periods before and after. But at the same time, there is this what was called the age of possibility that is normally applied to the late Ottoman and in some way also the Mandate period. Still, there were the potential history of the Jordanian period. I know that other scholars are working on that. With the Jerusalem Quarterly, a special issue will be also devoted to this period of time. Hanein Nam is working on these topics. So there is an increasing interest in that. It has still to change the most well-known image and photograph of this period, which is still dominated by other aspects. I'm not saying, of course, that this was a positive or pleasant period of time, not at all. It was very conflictual and dramatic and tragic, and not bad, but it's important for historians to dig in that.
As we're reaching the end of the interview, I want to bring you to somewhere else in Jerusalem. A long time ago, when I was at the very beginning of my own work, on my PhD and my research on Jerusalem, I remember I was walking alongside Jaffa Road, with a purpose to find what was the Italian consulate during the late Ottoman period. And so I had an old map, and I eventually found it. It turned out to be right now it's a convent, or it's a house where some nuns live. But more importantly, I also found out, as they allowed me to visit briefly, that it was the seat of an occasional church back then, but I think right now it's definitely hosting masses on a regular basis of the Hebrew-speaking Catholics. When I was told about the existence of the group, I must say that I was surprised, to say the least. I never expected to find Catholics who would use Hebrew in Jerusalem. And I found myself asking questions. Who are these people? Why are they using Hebrew? And in time, I get to know some of them. One was also a guest here on the show, David Neuhaus. But I want to hear from you a little bit more about the history of what is known as the Association of St. James, which is the Hebrew-speaking Catholic community in Jerusalem at large in Israel. A group that I would say, for obvious reason, does not necessarily publicize very much its activities.
Yes, so in 2011, I was, it was during my PhD, and I was in Jerusalem working in the French Research Center. And exactly through Father David that you mentioned, I could meet Yochanan Elichai, who is one of the founders of the community. And for me, this meeting was extremely important. It completely changed also my actually my work after that moment, because he opened the archives, which is again the multiplicity and the variety of archives in this case were a part of his room. So he didn't live in a convent or a monastery or another religious building. He lived in an ordinary flat apartment in Jerusalem. And in this flat, he had also many documents that he collected during all his life. And so Yochanan Elichai, that was his name is Jean Leroy. He was one of the founders of the St. James community in the early 1950s, as I try to retrace in one chapter of my book. And that at that time, the name was the St. James Association, Le Vrai Saint-Jacques. And it was composed by different people, many coming from Europe, some of them with Jewish origins or converts from Judaism to Christianity, especially to Catholicism, that went to Israel after the Second World War, after the Holocaust, and started to meet and to establish a church, a community, let's say, a community extremely linked to Judaism. So they promoted a new vision of a relationship between Christianity and especially Catholicism and Judaism. They opened the foyer, so some apartments in Israel, where to meet up and to share prayers, but also the reading of the Bible, but also cultural events, and we will see also political interpretations in some way. Some of them became intellectuals in Israel, also authors and professors at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Some of them contributed to the Second Vatican Council and to the very troubled genesis of the Nostra Aetate document. They tried to establish a Catholic kibbutz. They translated the liturgy into Hebrew, and some of them were involved also in the Israeli-Palestinian pacifist movement. Bruno Sar was the founder actually of the Neve Shalom village in Israel, gathering Jewish Israelis and Arabs in the state. And also it's a very interesting history because some of them elaborated a form of Catholic Zionism. So it's a very problematic history, which was opposed by another part of the community. And this reflected all the complexity of these kinds of identities and all the complexity of the effects of history to religious communities. So some other members rejected these interpretations, especially after at the outbreak and after the Second Intifada. And nowadays the community is different. Father David made a huge work in this sense, and it's a tiny but very important community within the church because it testifies all the multiplicity of belonging to the church. It gives a sense of the inner diversity of the church, especially in a context like Jerusalem. In my book, I focused on the very first phase of this history. So basically the 1950s. I wrote some papers and the articles in other journals on the following phases, and I'm currently writing a monograph covering the 1940s to nowadays history of this community. And it's interesting because, again, it's not a Jerusalem limited community. I found correspondence and documents on the other side of the ocean. So in New York, in New Jersey, there are documents sent from the members to the American Jewish Committee, to Christian leaders involved in the Israeli-Palestinian relations and dialogue. So it's a tiny but well-connected community. It was a tiny but well-connected community. And for an historian, it's extremely interesting to retrace all these links and relations.
Well, I recently went to a number of mass celebrations out of curiosity, particularly in Jerusalem. What I noticed was that there's a growing presence of economic migrants that do work mostly for Israeli families around Jerusalem, many coming from India or the Philippines. And the interesting thing is that if they cannot go, to mass in an English-speaking, celebration, they certainly use Hebrew, which now has become some sort of a lingua franca. And so I found it like, puzzling to see how Hebrew now is becoming this language for migrants, and they basically start attending in large numbers, this community in Jerusalem. And so I found it like, again, interesting, puzzling, and something that I guess we have to reckon with. I mean, there is this new, small but relevant community that is emerging in the city, and not just in the city. Obviously, there are parishes throughout Palestine and Israel.
Yes, definitely. Deculating faith in different, through Hebrew, it's seen from an historical perspective. It's really puzzling, as you were saying, because in my current researches, I found the first catechism in Hebrew, which was printed in 1945 by the Franciscan Printing Press, against the Franciscans, approved by the Latin Patriarchate, sent to Rome. So 1945, let's think about this date. Catechism in Hebrew for converts. And now it's completely different, of course, the situation. So we are in a totally different scenario, and Hebrew becomes a way to connect people with very different background. The experience of migration that you were describing affects the sense of belonging to the church, and the Hebrew passes through these elements. So it's unexpected, but it's again the daily life that teaches us, because when children go to school and are taught in Hebrew, and their experience of life is in Hebrew, and the church has to refocus on different tools, on different forms of catechism, for example, and David Neuhaus has made a brilliant work in that, not with apologetic, intense, different reasons. Languages are, as archives, languages are really are powerful in the history of Christian communities, and still they dominate some way, and they are keys of entrance. Also to understand the teaching, the the preaching activities, the church.
This was Maria Chiara Rioli, currently a Marie Curie Fellow at Ca' Foscari in Venice, Italy, and Fordham, New York, and author of the book published by Brill in 2020, A Liminal Church, Refugees, Conversions, and the Latin Diocese of Jerusalem, 1946 to 1956. Maria Chiara, thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you to all those listening to this conversation. Thank you again.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.